It is truly a great pleasure and an honor to welcome to our community former Chief Rabbi of England, Rabbi Dr. Lord Jonathan Sacks. Baruch haba. "14 years ago, in the year 2000, Y2K, Palm Beach Synagogue moved from its hotel rental space to this very building that we're sitting in today at 120 North County Road. And to mark that great milestone, we had the honor and privilege of inviting the then current Chief Rabbi of England, Rabbi Dr. Lord Jonathan Sacks, to be our guest speaker for that Shabbat and Sunday dedication. We are overjoyed and delighted that 14 years later we have merited again to welcome Rabbi Sacks back to our community. My only prayer is that we won't have to wait till 2028 for the next visit, but God willing, Rabbi Sacks will be able to join us more frequently. This summer, my family and I spent a month in Israel. And one Friday night we were eating Shabbat dinner at the founder of the synagogue, Jeffrey Kashuk, and Audrey Kashuk's home. And they told us with great excitement that just a week or two before in their synagogue, they had the honor of hosting Rabbi Sacks as their guest speaker, scholar in residence. And after sharing the Dvar Torah with great enthusiasm, they said he also told a great joke. And they proceeded to tell me the joke he told. He says, an elderly Jew was admitted to General Mass, one of the finest hospitals, Mass General, one of the finest hospitals in the country. And after being there just a few days, he says to his family, I want to leave this hospital. They say, where do you want to go? He says, I want to go to this particular hospital on the other side of town. Is it that hospital? It's a second-rate hospital, it's a schlocky hospital. Why would you want to go there? You're in one of the finest hospitals in the world. And he says, I want to leave. And so he's insistent, they have no choice. They transfer him to the second-rate hospital at the other end of town in Boston. Well, this hospital wasn't used to getting patients from Mass General. And so they were delighted and overjoyed to welcome him there. And the staff immediately gathered around his bed and they said, tell us, what was it about that hospital? Why did you choose to come to our hospital? Was it the doctors? And the elderly Jew says, no, the doctors were all the finest doctors, brilliant geniuses, all a bunch of Einsteins. He says, so was it the nurses maybe? He said, no, the nurses, they were all angels. Your wish was their command. They said, well, was it the food at Mass General? He said, no, the food was gourmet food, 5-star dining. So they said, so why did you transfer to our hospital? And this elderly Jew says, because I had nothing to complain about. We Jews have a reputation of being fetchers or complainers. As Jackie Mason says, that the difference between a Jewish restaurant and a non-Jewish restaurant is in a non-Jewish restaurant, the waiter comes over at the end of the meal and says, was everything okay? In a Jewish kosher restaurant, the waiter comes over and says, was anything okay? But nothing could be further from the truth, because this week's Parsha tells us about the birth of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the fourth son is Yehudah, which Leah names Yehuda because Leah says, Hapam Odet Hashem, I will give thanks and gratitude and thankfulness to God. And we as a Jewish people are not named Ruvenim or Sheminim or Leviim or Yissacharim, but we're named after one particular tribe collectively, and that is Yehudim. We are Jews from the word Judah, because the mission statement of the Jew is encapsulated in that one word, lahodot, to give gratitude, to give thanks to God. From the morning we wake up, we say Moda Ani, and throughout the day we praise God continuously. And so what a befitting holiday, like Thanksgiving, to dwell on this subject of the meaning of Thanksgiving and the art of Thanksgiving. And we are fortunate to have with us tonight, without exaggeration, the leading rabbi on planet Earth. You cannot ask for a greater scholar, rabbi, teacher to articulate this message than Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Rabbi Sacks' resume, his CV, is about 8 pages long. So I'm going to have to just summarize some of the highlights of his very, very extensive and impressive resume. A global religious leader, philosopher, author, and moral voice for our time, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks is currently the Ingbert and Ira Rennett Global Distinguished Professor of Judaic Thought at New York University and the Koresel and Efrat Family University Professor of Jewish Thought at Yeshiva University. He has also been appointed a Professor of Law, Ethics, and the Bible at King's College in London. Previously, Rabbi Sacks served as Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth between September 1991 and September 2013. Only the sixth incumbent since the role was formalized in 1845. Described by the Honorable Prince of Wales as a light unto this nation, and by former British Prime Minister Tony Blair as an intellectual giant, Rabbi Sacks is a frequent contributor to radio, television, and the press, both in Britain and around the world. A visiting professor at several universities in Britain, the United States, and Israel, Rabbi Sacks holds 16 honorary degrees, including a Doctor of Divinity conferred to mark his first 10 years in office as Chief Rabbi by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey. In recognition of his work, Rabbi Sacks has won several international awards, including the Jerusalem Prize in 1995 for his contribution to diaspora Jewish life. He is an author of over 25 books. He has published commentaries on the Daily Jewish Prayer Book, the Siddur, and has completed commentaries to the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Pesach Festival prayer books, Mazorim to date. And I just wanted to digress that Rabbi Sacks has a special affinity for children, and he published a children's prayer book that we are very proud to use every Shabbat and Sunday in our programs on Shabbos and in Hebrew school, the finest siddur for children out in the marketplace. And we are fortunate to use that, as well as Rabbi Sacks also has a beautiful voice. You can see some of his YouTube videos. He loves to sing, especially with the children. His most popular video with the children singing Oseh Shalom. Born in 1948 in London, Rabbi Sacks attended Gonville and Harris College in Cambridge, receiving honors in philosophy. He continued his studies at New College, Oxford, and King's College, London, where he earned his doctorate in 1981. The same year, he was ordained as Jews College and at Yeshiva Eitz Chaim, both in London. He served as the rabbi for Golden's Green Synagogue and Marble Arch Synagogue in London. Before taking the post of Chief Rabbi, he also was principal of Jews College, the world's oldest rabbinical seminary. In 1970, Rabbi Sacks married his wife, Elaine, who we are privileged to host with us tonight, and they have 3 children, Joshua, Dina, and Gila, and several grandchildren. Ladies.
It really is such a delight to be with you, to see. We were with you, as you say, in 2000 for the formal first consecration of the shul, and to come back and to see how you've grown is something really incredible and deeply impressive. I think every one of you deserves thanks for that tremendous achievement. You really are a major presence here. But I think you are so blessed by your wonderful Rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Shaina, and your incredible Rebbetzin, Rebbetzin Dini Shaina. And together, I wish that they may lift and inspire you, that you continue to lift and inspire them, and may you continue to grow and be blessed for many years to come. Amen. Friends, you asked me to speak about Thanksgiving, and we don't actually do that in England. We don't do that amongst Yidden, as the rabbi's already explained, but I have to tell you a tiny little story. Can you hear me? Is that okay? I have to tell you a tiny little story. I don't know if you know this, we say around Elul time, and throughout Elul and towards the end of Tishrei, a special psalm. We say morning and evening, Psalm 27, L'David Hashem Ari V'Yishi. And there's a question in Jewish law. Do you or don't you say L'David Hashem Ari V'Yishi on Shmini Atzeres? Some say yes, some say no. Some Jewish communities had the custom to do it. Some of them didn't have the custom to do it. And we had in Anglo-Jewry an authorized Siddur which contained the magnificent instruction that said you say this till Shmini Atzeres, leaving it completely open as to whether the English word till means up to and including, or up to and not including. So nobody knew, do you or don't you say Shmini L'David Hashem Aribiyishi on Shmini Atzeres. This is a true story. It happened just shortly before I was born. A major shul in London, the Chazan got up on Shmini Atzeres and started saying L'David Hashem Aribiyishi. The shul warden got up and said, "Shah!" The Chazan kept going. The warden said, "Stop!" The Chazan said, "But you say L'David Hashem Aribiyishi on Shmini Atzeres." The warden said, "You don't say it on Shmini Atzeres." The Chazan said, "But I am the Chazan." And the warden said, "But I'm the warden, you're fired." And he sacked him on the spot. The Chazan took his case to an English court of law on the ground of unfair dismissal. The case came before an English judge, a non-Jewish judge, to decide was the Chazan fairly or unfairly dismissed. This depends entirely on whether you do or don't say L'David Hashem Aribiyishi or Shmini Atzeres. So the English judge has to paskin, do you or don't you say L'David Hashem? This man was Chacham Enav Barosha. He had the wisdom of Solomon. He had the psalm said out loud in English in the courtroom, and he looked up at the end of the psalm and said, "You know what? That psalm is so beautiful, I think we should say it every day." The Chazan got his job back and peace was restored. The reason I'm telling you this is that coming from England, whose climate is not exactly identical to that of Palm Beach, I have to say on behalf of Elaine and myself, if we lived in Palm Beach, in such a beautiful place as this, with such incredible weather like this, with a kehillah like yours, and with a Rav like Rabbi and Rabbis in China, we would make Thanksgiving every single day. But it is an extraordinary thing, despite the fact that Jews complain, and we really do complain. You know, you read the Torah, and you think to yourself, here's Moshe Rabbeinu, you know, wanting a quiet life. And the Kadosh Baruch Hu says, go and lead the Jewish people, and Moshe Rabbeinu must have been the greatest prophet in history because he knew exactly what that he would be laying himself in for, and so he refused 4 times if you look carefully. And Hashem said, no, to let my people go, take them out to freedom. And what did they do? They complained. You know, he takes them out into the desert, they complain. They find there's no food, they complain. He brings them down manna from heaven, they say, what about the fleishiks? They complain. They have no water, he gives them water from a rock, he doesn't bury it, they complain. And the truth is, they come up against the Red Sea and they complain, did you lead us out here to die in the wilderness? He divides the sea into 2. There's a path of dry land right the way through. And I have a postcard from a famous English politician who sent us this postcard. He thought we'd enjoy it. They're the Bnei Israel. The sea is divided. And Moshe Rabbeinu is standing there telling them to go. And they're turning to Moshe Rabbeinu and they're saying, but what about the puddles? So, you know, we became a complaining people, but the truth is, as Yorov mentioned, we're going to read this week in Shul about how Leah named her 4th son, Yehuda, with the words, Zodapam Odet Hashem, this time I will thank God. And don't forget who Yehuda is. He was the ancestor of Israel's kings, of David HaMelech, B'mei Rabbi Yameinu of the Mashiach, and we are called Yehudim because of Judah. The word Yehudi means to give thanks. It comes from the same root as Toda Rabbah, Modeh. And therefore to be a Jew is to give thanks. And it seems to me that it's so important that we do so. And that is really, it goes to the very essence of who we are. Elaine and I, as you heard, got married 44 years ago. And this is how I learned the meaning of thanks. Now, I mean, I thank Hashem daily that Elaine puts up with me. You know, I have to say that the only reason I ever got to speak in public is because I married the world's greatest listener. And I remember many years ago, and it still shames me to remember this, that 20, 30 years ago, I was practicing a talk on Elaine. And after a while, she wanted to say something, and I kept going. And I kept going and going until finally, like at school, she lifted her hand up to make an interruption. And I said to her, don't interrupt when I'm speaking about dialogue. But it was on our honeymoon, actually, that we went to a little Italian town, a coastal town. We've never been there since. It's called Paestum. It's famous. It has Roman ruins. And it was the most brilliant, brilliant sunlit day. And it was a lovely, beautiful, calm sea. And it was so inviting. The only trouble was my parents, Aleim Shalom, never learned Gemara, because one thing Gemara tells you is one of the duties of a parent to a child is to teach the child how to swim. My parents never taught me, and I can't. But the sea was so inviting. And as I looked at the sea, I could see people standing several hundred yards out to sea. And the water was only up to their knees. So I thought, okay, I'll go out, I'll paddle in the water out. And so I did. I went out a couple of hundred yards, quite away from the shore. And the water was up to my knees. I turned around to come back, and I suddenly found myself out of my depth. There were no other swimmers nearby. They were way away. I couldn't swim. And as I went under for the 5th time, I remember you're supposed to see your whole life pass in front of you. Mine didn't. I remember thinking 2 thoughts. Number 1, what a way to start a honeymoon. And number 2, what's the Italian for help? Well, somebody clearly saw me struggling, rescued me, carried me more or less unconscious, and deposited me by Elaine. To this day, I don't know who saved my life. But to this day, ever since then, I have known what it means to say from the heart, Modeh ani lefanecha, melech chai v'kayam she'ezarta bi nishmati. Thank you, God, each day, for giving me back my life. And I think it is not by accident that the first word a Jew says in the morning is Modeh, Modah, thank you. That is what it is to be a Jew. To be a Jew is to give thanks. And of course, that is incidentally and obliquely what led the first Americans to create this institution of Thanksgiving, which went through various Gilgulim, various realizations, from the Pilgrim Fathers on the Mayflower in 1620 to Washington in 1789 to really Abraham Lincoln in 1863, trying to create a national Thanksgiving Day as opposed to a lot of different Thanksgiving days. And sometimes we are not fully aware of the extent to which Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, shaped and influenced America's political culture. The only reason I know about this, and it's quite an odd story, I was telling the rabbi about it, Rebbetzin, just a little while back, that way back, early on in my chief rabbinate, in 1993, we had a very, very bad crime in Britain. 2 10-year-old boys who, Rahman al-Islam, killed a 4-year-old boy. And this sent shockwaves throughout Britain, and I wrote an article about it in our leading daily paper, The Times of London. And the next day we got a phone call from the Prime Minister, who was then John Major. Would I come and see him? He'd read the article and he wanted to discuss it with me. I remember the first thing, I mean, this is the first time you go and sit at one-to-one with the Prime Minister. I still remember his opening remark. He said, "Tell me, Jonathan, what should I do about crime?" It was a really good question. I suggested be against it, Prime Minister. And from then on, I found myself advising Prime Ministers, 4 of them, John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and David Cameron. And I thought and the reason that they found it quite comforting to discuss their problems with the chief rabbi was, number one, they knew I didn't want their job. And number two, they knew I wasn't going to ask them, why weren't you in church on Sunday? So it was a really, really comfortable and engaging relationship. And the end result was, I thought, look, if I'm advising Prime Ministers on their problems, these were never Jewish issues, they were on crime, on marriage, the family breakdown, welfare, child poverty, all that kind of stuff. And I thought, you know, if I'm advising people, I'd better know something about it. So I started to learn about politics and political philosophy, and I wrote several books on the subject for non-Jews. And it taught me all sorts of very, very interesting things about political cultures, and the one that makes America unique among all the nations of the world. And the reason is very simple. America is the only country whose entire political structure is based on Tanakh. No European country has that kind of phenomenon at all. And the reason is that the first people who came to America were Puritans. They were Calvinists. And the Calvinists were far and away the closest Christianity ever got to Judaism, because the Calvinists derive their inspiration from Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible. The Catholic Church, as you know, is based not on the authority of the Bible, it's based on the authority of the Church, which is why Luther came up with his insistence, sola scriptura, the only authority we have is Scripture. But Luther himself was focused more or less entirely on the New Testament, especially the writings of Paul, whereas Calvin based himself pretty much entirely on the Hebrew Bible. And the result is that all those early arrivals here in America, on the Mayflower, on the Arabella, and so on, they knew Tanakh. They read it in Hebrew. They quoted from it constantly. When John Winthrop aboard the Arabella in 1630 made his famous speech about the city on a hill, that great speech, he quotes Barichas. He's quoting from Devarim chapter 30, talking about making a covenant with this new land. And the American political philosophy is based on covenant. And it's all because of Calvinism. Incidentally, this had an unusual bit in my life, because in 2010, Princeton Theological Seminary gave me an award for, it's called the Abraham Kuyper Prize, which you get for making a major contribution to Dutch neo-Calvinist theology. There are not a lot of Rabbanim who have this award. I came back to Elaine and I said, look, I think everything is alles by Hashgacha. You know, HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes things happen for a reason. I cannot imagine any conceivable reason why I was given an award for Dutch neo-Calvinist theology. But I discovered the reason 2 years later. I don't know if you read about this 2 years ago. The Dutch Parliament banned Shechita. Do you remember this? You read about this. So the Dutch jury asked me to come and address the Dutch Parliament, which I did, both houses. And I said to them, you know, you're asking yourself, by what authority do I stand here? And I said, I only have 3 credentials on which to stand here. Number one, because it was a Dutch Jew from Amsterdam, Manasseh ben Israel, who persuaded Oliver Cromwell in 1655 to let Jews back into England. So I said, if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be an us. I said, secondly, I'm also professionally a philosopher, and Holland was the city of refuge for philosophers when it was unsafe for them to stay in their country. So not only, of course, Spinoza lived in Amsterdam, but John Locke and René Descartes escaped to Holland when it was not safe for them to stay in England or France. And number three, I'm probably the only rabbi in the world with a doctorate, an award in Dutch neo-Calvinist theology. So I explained by what standing I had to stand there. I must say, I then delivered the shortest drasha I have ever given in my life. It consisted of 2 sentences. I said, Holland was the place where European religious liberty was born. Don't let it be the place where European religious liberty died. And I sat down. And Baruch Hashem, they did pull back. I'm not saying that speech did it, but Shkita has now been permitted again in Holland. So everything happens for a reason. The fact is that it made this covenantal basis, this biblical thing, made the American political culture unique in the modern world. And it is because it is a covenantal society based on the story of the revelation of Sinai in Shmos chapters 19 and 20, and the book of Sefer Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. Now, the end result is that it is a completely different culture to Britain. It's most curious. And can I give you an example? You know, if you go to Washington and you go to the memorials, what do you see about those memorials? It's very interesting. Every one of those memorials tells a story. So you get to the Lincoln Memorial, and on one side you've got the Gettysburg Address, and standing reminder to Rabbonim, I must say, you know, at Gettysburg, Everett, who was the speaker before Lincoln, spoke for 2 hours. Abraham Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes. I tend to veer to the Everett side. And so on one side you've got the Gettysburg Address, on the other side the second inaugural. You go down to the Roosevelt Memorial, you know, which has a little series of spaces, one for each decade of his public life, with the most famous sentence from that period, you know, with nothing to fear but fear itself, and so on. There's the Martin Luther King Memorial, which Elaine and I still haven't seen, but it's got over 200 quotations from Martin Luther King. And then, of course, that wonderful Apollonian memorial to Thomas Jefferson with long quotations from the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty, and so on. They all tell a story. Now go to London, Parliament Square, where we have all our memorials. The memorial for David Lloyd George consists of 3 words. David Lloyd George. Nelson Mandela gets 2, Nelson Mandela. And Winston Churchill, who produced more memorable utterances than any other British politician, who won the Nobel Prize not for peace but for literature, Churchill gets 1 word, Churchill. And it's an extraordinary thing. Why is it that every American memorial tells a story and no British memorial tells a story? The answer is because America is a covenantal nation, and one of the essences of covenant is you tell the story. You remember in biblical times, when you brought the first fruits, you said a passage which all of us know because we said every Pesach, Arami, Oved, Avi, Vayered, Mitzrayim. We tell the story of where we come from. And that is a covenant society. It always is about the story that got us to be the nation that we are. And all covenant societies are based on a story. Britain is a traditional society, and in a traditional society, things are there because they're there. That's the only reason. They always were, they've been there since time immemorial, etc., etc. I discovered what this British culture is like when they made me a member of the most famous club in Britain. It's called the Athenaeum. But you go and look in the mall, just, you know, between Buckingham Palace and Trafalgar Square. You'll walk up and down there for a year and you won't find the Athenaeum. Why? Because nowhere on the building, outside or inside, does it say Athenaeum. Why? Because if you have to ask, you don't belong. And that is a traditional society. It's there because it always was. And it has no story. But in America, covenantal society, it tells a story. So for instance, from about 1995, you mentioned Y2K. From about 1995, the government was consulting with me, and doubtless with other religious leaders, how we would like to take part in the Millennium celebrations. You know, the actual turn of the millennium. You know, they had this big thing called the Millennium Dome and all sorts of things. So I kept saying to the government, please, it's your birthday, it's not our birthday. Get us in the hay, have a wonderful time. Enjoy yourself, don't worry about us, we've got other birthdays. The Archbishop of Canterbury, I couldn't go anywhere, it was a Friday night, if you remember. He came in over Shabbos. The Archbishop of Canterbury said, Jonathan, do you think you could get the Jewish community to join us in celebrating the millennium? I said, George, how would you like to do it? He said, well, we'll all be lighting a candle for the millennium. I said, George, we go born better, we'll light too. It was an extraordinary thing, you know. I was saying to the government, look, Jewishly, please, it's not our day, it's your day, have a wonderful time. But you want to know how to celebrate the millennium, tell the story. And they just didn't understand what I was talking about. They really didn't. And they didn't tell the story in the millennium. They eventually got around to it in 2012 for the Olympics. They kind of told the story. But the millennium, there was no story. Incidentally, the millennium was one of those occasions when you know, I realized how strange and ironic sometimes it is being a Rav. Because we woke up one September on a Sunday morning, September 1999, big front page banner headline, Constitutional Crisis Looms Over Millennium Ceremony. What was the crisis? The crisis was that they weren't going to have a Christian prayer at the millennium. Because the BBC that was covering all the events thought, you know, it's not attractive enough, you know, we're a secular Britain, we don't need a Christian prayer at the millennium. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury, who'd make representations to the BBC 5 times, the government 4 times, and got nowhere with it, was threatening to boycott the millennium ceremony. Since the Queen, who was at the heart of the millennium ceremony, is the head of the Church of England, she was faced with a constitutional crisis. Can she go? How can she go if our Archbishop of Canterbury is boycotting the ceremony? But how can she not go since she's the guest of honor? So I'm sitting in the BBC studios. I used to do a certain amount of broadcasting for the BBC on their morning news program the day after this story. I do my little broadcast, and after my piece, they said, the announcer said, now we're going to the constitutional row over whether there will be a Christian prayer at the millennium. And the BBC could, you know, the BBC has something called radio cars. If you can't get your speaker in the audience, they'll send a mobile studio so that you can record from where you happen to be. And both the bishop who was arguing on one way and the politician who was arguing the other way were not in the studio, so I was listening in the headphones. And the presenter of the program, who was an old friend of mine, saw that I was staying. Since this was live, he couldn't say anything, but he wrote a note, would you like to join in? Now, you tell me of a Jew who sees a good argument, who doesn't want to join in? So of course I said, yes, I'll join in. So he said, and here we have in the studio, still with us, is the Chief Rabbi. What do you think, Chief Rabbi, should there be? Christian prayer at the millennium or not. So I said, since the only reason there is a millennium is that it's the 2000th anniversary of Christianity, not to have a Christian prayer would be stark raving bonkers. I don't know how you put that in American, the logic, okay? So, and I said, let me say this as a Jew. I said, because Britain is a Christian country, and because the Church of England is such a tolerant institution, we have the right to pray as Jews in this country. Shall I not, as a Jew, stand up for the right of the Church of England to have a Christian prayer in this country? And that was the end of the conversation. The next morning, the Archbishop of Canterbury phones up and says, Jonathan, you did it. So now you know how they got So here it is. This is, you know, there was this thing that we do every single year of telling this story. It used to be with the first fruits, now on Pesach. And of course there was a mitzvah, the 612th of the 613 mitzvahs, that every 7 years the king gathers the people and tells the story. Now there's only one place in the world where this mitzvah, Hakel, is carried out. And it is carried out here in the United States. Only you call it a presidential inaugural address. And it's absolutely fascinating, because if you split the difference between 1 year and 7 years, you get 4 years, and that's every 4 years, the president, in his inaugural address, essentially renews the covenant. And it's fascinating, if you analyze presidential inaugural addresses, you'll see it. For instance, you will see, number one, that every single presidential inaugural, since Washington's first in 1789, all the way to Barack Obama's on the 21st of January 2030, every single one of those inaugurals mentions the word God. With one exception, Washington's second, which only lasted 3 minutes and essentially said, too busy, get back to work, and so on. But I mean, other than that, every single presidential inaugural has mentioned the word God. Tony Blair was a deeply religious man, but his office did not allow him to use the word God for the whole 10+ years he was Prime Minister. Every time somebody asked Tony Blair about his religious beliefs, his press officer intervened and said, we don't do God. And actually, I did the first interview with Tony Blair for BBC television after he was